Hello, my name's Jared Brown, master distiller of Sipsmith and historian of drink. And we're going to be talking about gin. It's a favorite subject, as you probably already know. But I'd like to begin at the beginning. Let's go all the way back. Where did all of this start? 7,000 BC, 9,000 years ago in China, was the earliest evidence of intentional fermentation. The earliest distillation also began in China a few thousand years ago. The trade of knowledge was the most important trade on the Silk Road from China into Western Europe. I like to begin just by looking at that so that we understand this is a lot older than we realize. It goes back a lot further. In fact, civilization was born with the discovery of drink because as a species, we could not live in a settled community without alcohol. And not just to get along with the neighbors, but also because the number one cause of death throughout history was waterborne diseases. And the only preventive and curative was drink. In fact, we moved as a species from hunter-gatherer to agrarian to grow grain, not to bake bread, as we were taught in school, but to make beer. They have found the fields that prove when we first grew grain, they never found the ovens. They found big pots. So it was definitely for making beer and for making wine. But let's move on quickly into talking about juniper. Juniper, the fundamental ingredient, was first imported into the UK, into England, in the mid-1200s by the Genoese merchants. Yes, juniper grows in England. It grows throughout Europe, but the best came from the Mediterranean. And there is no question, even today, the best juniper is from the Mediterranean. That's where the perfect flavor comes from. So the Genoese merchants discovered a very lucrative business in exporting juniper. You may have heard that the English soldiers discovered gin when they were fighting in Holland in the 30 Years' War, and they found the Dutch troops drinking Dutch courage. I would like to apologize for all of the historians who have told you that. It is a wonderful fiction, but it is not true that it was discovered by the English at that time. The English were already drinking it. They were already distilling with juniper. The reason that it wasn't recognized is because brewing and distillation were women's work. Up until the mid-1600s, it was all done by women. So looking in the formula books and in the alchemy books and the chemistry books, you didn't find the recipes. You know where I found the recipes? Housekeeping manuals, hints for the home, the women's books. The 1602 women's book in England had a juniper spirit recipe before Dutch courage. And in fact, by 1621, there were 200 licensed distillers in London already. 1738, the Worshipful Company of Distillers was formed, but actually it was reformed. They'd had some trouble with Henry VIII, I believe it was, who put them out of business temporarily. And they went on to publish I hate when I have to read something. I'm not good at that. The Worshipful Company of Distillers published the Distiller of London for the sole use of members of the guild. So there was already a distilling publication in London in the 1630s, 1640s. But juniper at this time was primarily a medicinal. In fact, what they were doing in Holland was making Geneva, but that was a medicine. It was not available in bars. It was available from the pharmacist. It was the same early on in England. One famous English writer, Samuel Pepys, in 1663, he wrote, "Strong water made of juniper, to make myself break wind and go freely to stool." We've decided this is not a good promotion for gin. But I think it was probably bad spirit with the juniper that was having that effect. And certainly the spirit has improved greatly since. But gin was born in London. It was when King William of Orange came to the throne in 1688, sharing the throne with Queen Mary. They were at war with France. They wanted to stop importing French brandy. And they were also faced with a grain surplus. And they wanted to use up this grain surplus. So King William asked the Worshipful Company of Distillers to make spirit from grain. And they said, no, absolutely not. There had been 3 famines in the 15 years before this. So they couldn't understand the nation now faced an opposite problem. So to fix this, he simply took away their power of license. To explain this, to become a brewer at this time, you had to buy an apprenticeship to a brewer. You had to take communion every Sunday. You could not have a criminal record. And then someday, you might be taken into the brewing guild to be a brewer yourself for a lifetime paying taxes to the guild. To become a distiller now, you had to put a sign on your door. In 10 days, that was a legal distilling premises. You were a distiller. I don't know what the sign was for, because there was no way for neighbors to object to this. But it worked, and meanwhile, in Holland, Geneva was still not available in taverns. King William's physician wrote a book on the gardens of his palace in Luz. It was the most boring book I've ever read, except for chapter 8, which talked about the food and drink in Holland at that time. And he said, morning or night, everyone drank bad French wine made palatable with the addition of wormwood. Wormwood is the ingredient that makes absinthe, but it's also the ingredient that makes vermouth. So what they were drinking was vermouth. in Holland. Whereas in England, suddenly, this was becoming a social drink. In 1690, there were 500,000 gallons of spirit produced. 1713, this was not yet a problem, so Parliament made yet another declaration that any person may distill spirits from British malt. By the 1730s, it was recognized now that King William of Orange's good work had created an epidemic. And so Parliament began regulating this with the Gin Acts of 1736, 1737, 1743, 1750, 51, 1786, 1823, 1825, 1830. I won't bore you with details of these. I've only done that to one audience, and that was a committee of ministers of Parliament in Parliament. I didn't know I was going to do that day. Someone in the office said, "Hey, can you jump in an Uber?" I did. And I said, "Where are we going?" She said, "Parliament." "What are we doing?" She said, "We're not. You're going to give a talk." "About what?" "Gin." "Oh, okay. No problem." I'd forgotten about it when 2 weeks later, Parliament called and said, "By the way, you're now the official gin distiller for Parliament." Let's look at what was happening at this time. 1751. Now, think of it. The brewers, they're struggling at this point. Nobody wants to be a brewer. And it's more expensive to make beer than to make spirits. So they started making propaganda. They hired William Hogarth, who did Gin Lane, which, wow, can you guys see this? This is a little pixelated, but this was a picture of London disintegrating because of the negative effects of strong drink. No, I'm not disintegrating, okay. Then Beer Street showed a very healthy nation, not because people were not drinking, but because they were drinking beer. You know, here, the pawn shop is very successful. Here, it is failing. The coffin maker has good business. Here, he is out of business. The workers here, you can't see them, but 3 men working on the roof. They have no ropes. Don't worry, they're safe. They're drinking pints of beer while they are working. So this was some wonderful propaganda that didn't work because it was very cold in England at this time. England was still in the Little Ice Age. We talk about global warming today. They would have loved global warming. In fact, the Thames froze over approximately every 10 years for a few hundred years. And they got onto the Thames and they had a party. The first one, 1714. Now, gin was born 1690, 1714. There was a tent for Geneva and one for gingerbread. By 1743, you can't quite see it, but this says gin and gingerbread. This was the first pairing of food and spirits that we found in history, was gin and gingerbread. It's a very good pairing, by the way. I know some people like to combine whiskey and ginger too. That works. But into the 19th century, we are still in the grips of this gin craze, this gin epidemic, despite all of those acts of parliament which did not stop the amount people were drinking. What they did do was they got rid of bad distillation practices. So this spirit, born by royal decree in 1689, began to evolve through the successive acts of parliament. It got better and better because of those acts. Something else that improved the spirit immensely, the coffee still. Patented in 1831 by an Irish tax collector who, when you're an Irish tax collector trying to collect taxes on whiskey distillers, you get beaten up a lot. After he was hospitalized twice, he didn't want to do that job anymore, but he had seen very good design for stills. And so he modified with just a couple of pipes someone else's design, but it was enough to patent it and to make a very good still. And this revolutionized things, but we should understand something about how this really influenced spirits. People think, oh, this came along in 1831, therefore in 1831, spirits everywhere were suddenly cleaner and better. Now, actually, it took until about the 1780s, or I'm sorry, the 1880s, before this was in widespread use. So if you are learning history of drink and you learn about the coffee still, the year it is patented is not important. The year that it came into broad use is very important. In whiskey, especially Irish, this was huge. In gin, this is why dry gin came along in the 1880s, is because this still was popularized. And that was a huge difference. Have you tried pochín or aguardiente or aguardente or other really raw, rough spirit made on a pot still? That was the base of gin before this was popularized. So this was the final point of the evolution of gin from Geneva, was right here. And then suddenly everyone was drinking it. In England, the bright young things. This was the jazz age partiers. Oh, good news, we have some tastes of gin coming out. Maybe. Now, you were in the right room. And this was the era of the hotel bars, when finally what was great spirit was getting treated well by great bartenders. That's Harry Craddock on this side of the Savoy, Ada Coleman, who was not the first female head bartender at the Savoy. Ruth Burgess was working there for 2 years before Ada started. They were not actually the best of friends. Ada would not share her recipes with Ruth. So they bartended side by side for 20 years without talking to each other. But Ada did have better recipes than Ruth, so she wanted her customers to come to her for her drinks. Very sadly, when the Americans began coming over during Prohibition, at that time they did not like female bartenders. Yeah, if the bartender was female, you had to make sure your fly was up, you had to watch your language. If the bartender was male, you could relax a bit. It was okay. And so Ada, who had started out working in the hotel flower shop, sadly ended her career back in the hotel flower shop, making buttonhole bouquets for her gentlemen. I wish her story had had a happier ending, but they don't all. But they had some very interesting customers at this time. Unfortunately, you can't quite see this. I've got a bar blocking the best part of this picture. But at the Savoy, they had, in the coat check, they had a place to put your cheetah or your leopard. If you can't see that, it's worth standing up and peeking over. Yeah, this was common. The Criterion on Piccadilly still has the original animal cages in its coat check. The singer Josephine Baker, she had a cheetah as well. Later, Audrey Hepburn had a deer. I wouldn't want to walk in with a deer if someone else has a cheetah. That just would end too predictably. But so did this age of opulence. Tragically, the Second World War came along, and that was the end of that opulence. That was the death of a generation of bartenders. That was the death of a generation of customers. That was the death of a lot of innocence. And in England, it was for a while the death of gin. Because after the wars, there was still grain rationing because there had been droughts. In 1962, Plymouth Gin took out full-page ads in magazines proudly saying, "The grain is back." The grain is back. So what were they using up till 1962? Molasses. You want to taste bad gin? Make it with molasses. The American whiskeys weren't better off. This is not published anywhere. You will never find evidence that this is true, but I met the man whose job it was to buy potatoes to make the #1 selling bourbon in the world. Extra credit if you know which one that is, because I'm not going to say the name. And it was made with potatoes after the Second World War. Very good, by the way. So, England, London had had a working gin still in 1 out of 4 buildings in the early 1700s. 200 in the 1600s. 2009, it had 1, just 1. Beefeater, and they had opened in 1820, and that was when this happened. But 2007, I met 2 young men who wanted to make gin in London as much as I did. I had been looking for a way to do this for years. As a distiller and a historian, I wanted to bring gin back, but I knew how to make it, but I didn't know how to do the rest. And at a Negroni party at the Beefeater Distillery, where I'd just finished working on the Beefeater 24, I met these 2 guys from Cornwall, Sam and Fairfax, who had just quit their jobs Sam was working for Fuller's Beer, helping to roll it out in the United States. Fairfax was working for some little spirits company, Diageo. That's the one. And the only thing they were missing was a distiller. So the next morning, after meeting them, after speaking to them, discovering they were as traditionalist as I was, we sat down to talk about what it would take to make gin in London. Thankfully, they had already been working for almost a year trying to get a license. It took 2.5 years to get that license because no one alive knew how to issue one. And so we were just told, no, we don't know how. Finally, they went to Scotland to find someone who knew how to issue a license. And we became the first distillery in London in almost 200 years. Felix, where shall I go from here? What's that? London Dry Gin? Good thought. And creating a formula, I looked for a London Dry formula for quite a while, but I realized the modern gins were not making the old style. So instead, I turned to this book from Roman numerals again, 1738. Here was a recipe for Geneva. Gin was not a polite word yet. It had one ingredient, juniper. I worked through formulas up to the 1860s when one of my books had a dozen different gin styles in it. Today we can only name 3, London Dry, Old Tom, and Plymouth. But they had table gin, cordial gin, fine cordial gin, cream of the valley, West Country gin, etc. So we made them to find out what a London Dry was historically, what it really was. In the absence of a benchmark, we set out to make a benchmark, to make a gin where if you draw an XY graph to be the center point, not to be anything new and different, but just to go to the heart of it. Interestingly, in this book, there was also instructions on how to test the strength, how to test proof. And it said, and for proof of your spirit of wine, put a little gunpowder in a spoon, which fill up with spirit of wine and set the spirits on fire. If they be perfectly dephlegmated, distilled, they will burn dry and blow up the gunpowder, meaning it will explode in your hand. So this was the test of proof. It's often been said that the Royal Navy did this because they didn't want spirits to leak onto the gunpowder in the event of battle on the ship. But if you look at the blueprints of any of the Navy ships, you'll see the powder was stored at one end and the spirit was stored at the other end. So the truth was, they just wanted to make sure they weren't getting ripped off. There were no accurate measures of the strength of alcohol at the time, so a distiller could put cayenne pepper in, and because these were stored in barrels, it was already colored, so that cayenne pepper would make it burn as if there was alcohol. In fact, for a time, it was illegal in London for a distiller to be in possession of chilies. for this reason. But London Dry, we have some in front of us, all except for me, again. Oh, there's some. Thank you so much, Al. What is a classic London Dry gin? And before we taste, please have a sip of water. It's important before you taste anything to have a sip of water because it will clear bad flavors off your palate. You've been sitting here breathing in and out for 30 minutes? Okay, thanks. And that has built up things on your palate. The first liquid will clear those off of your palate and you will taste them. And I want you to know they're not in my gin. So the water clears that palate. Now, on the nose, soft pine and citrus. This is the character of Mediterranean juniper. I can always tell in a blind taste if I'm tasting an American gin with American juniper because it smells and tastes like gum, like bubble gum. It's very fruity and sweet. There are places where that is good, not in my martini, but there are places it's good. So, soft pine, sweet citrus, a dry meadow, meadow flowers, earth, warm spice, and then citrus again. On the palate, the same. The first thing you will notice, it's warm, but it doesn't burn. That is a testament to the base. Yes, we'll skip those. There we go. Botanicals. The base spirit, which is wheat. Oh, that's just me. There we go. Here. I normally say, actually, I have 11 ingredients because the grain is also of equal importance. And the character, when you taste this, the creaminess and the spice, that is the wheat. But not just the wheat, that is the wheat meeting copper. Copper plus that wheat spirit gives birth to a very distinctive creaminess. And I actually based our base spirit on a whiskey from Islay, the Kilchoman New Make, which I tasted just after they started, and there I found the perfect expression of grain meets copper. They use barley. To be honest, the grain can make less of a difference than you realize. It's more about the fact it is grain against copper. I once did a blind tasting in the distillery, barley versus wheat, and I actually fooled everyone in the distillery. They couldn't tell which was which. It can be done. Yeah, copper, a very essential ingredient. But we do have another gin to taste. Now this one, VJOP, I'm sure you're all familiar with cognac, VSOP, the very special old pale. We're not French. It has nothing to do with them. It's very junipery, overproof. It was not intentional that it was overproof. And this was the most difficult thing I have ever made. This took 3.5 years to make. When we were making the London Dry formula, I realized there were 3 ways to introduce the juniper. With maceration, loading the still with spirit and botanicals, warming it up, and leaving it overnight. Or, without maceration, load the still with spirit and botanicals, distill immediately. Or, put spirit in the still, no botanicals. Put them in a basket in the top of the still, a carter head, a botanical basket, or next to the still, as you can do here. This is a botanical basket, so we could run it through there. So let's think about cooking carrots for a minute. 24 hours in a slow cooker, or carrot soup, or steamed carrots, 3 entirely different flavors from a carrot. Maceration, no maceration, botanical basket, 3 entirely different flavors from juniper, and no gin in the history of gin had brought the 3 expressions together to bring the full juniper flavor into a single gin. And I quickly found out why. Making gin is conducting an orchestra of botanicals, 1 brass, 1 woodwind, 1 percussion. Here was the first with 3 violins. First violin playing perfectly, second violin drunk in the parking lot, third violin having spent a few hours at the espresso machine. Getting them to balance was a nightmare until I brought the strength of the alcohol up over proof. Then, finally, they all balanced. Here on the nose, juniper. Juniper. Pine. Undertone of citrus. And this is the same 10 botanicals. At 57.7%, it's strong, but it still doesn't burn, because good spirits warm, bad spirits burn. It all depends on how well you make the base. This has quickly become the gin lover's only gin. This does not apologize for being gin. So, an important question that I would ask, except my batteries have died. Yeah, that slide. There we go. Is gin a trend? This is a question that keeps coming up. Is gin a trend? Yeah, what's next? I hear rum is next. Next year is rum. They've been saying that for about 10 years now. In Spain, my first visit to Spain, a bartender said, "Oh, gin is very popular. Next year, vodka." It didn't happen, did it? No. People drink vodka, people drink rum. There are some good vodkas, there are some great rums. But gin is not a trend. Spain has been a great nation of wine drinkers, so you didn't see as much of what happened in the rest of the world the past 25 years. In the United States, back in the 70s and 80s, people drank big jugs of cheap wine. And they went to the restaurant that gave you the biggest plate of food for your money. And then people began to discover small wineries making better wine. And people said, oh, this is a trend. Now, a trend is something that comes and goes. Evolution is not. And this was evolution amongst consumers. When they gained more sophistication, and your average consumer today has more wine knowledge than your average sommelier 15 years ago. That's the level we have come up on wine. On food, out there in the world where food wasn't Spanish, they went from the biggest plate to the best plate. And that has been the change in spirit that has brought about this meteoric growth in gin, which will not go away. Okay, there have been 340 licenses issued on the basis of Sipsmith legal work in the UK in the 9 years since we started. 10 years ago, or 10 years from now, perhaps a quarter of them will still be doing well. So for some, it's not that it was a trend, it was that using goji berries was not the best idea. Yeah, but for others, yes, gin will always be here. And it is growing as a category, as all good spirits are. And this is a fascinating trend or evolution that's taking place where people are moving from indulging or from binging, from drinking as much as they can, to indulging, drinking the best they can. And that's happening in large part because of you guys. We talk a lot about the golden age of drink, the cocktail renaissance, but that is happening here today. And that is happening because of you. Because we are all taking this profession seriously. We are moving it on. And we are sharing that education with the public, with the consumers. And this is making an enormous difference. And it's wonderful to see. It's a great time to be in this business. And on that note, I hope this is... Yes, we're working. I'd like to say gracias. Gracias. But, oh wait, this is a very old picture. A little newer. There we go. That's new. Gracias para todos. Whew.